as it relates to many of the different challenges we have around data as we take in the full scope of what our actual footprint with our data represents today. So a couple of the things we're going to cover, again, governance, security, what does multi-cloud mean as far as strategy, how you classify your data, how you plan your storage of that information. One of the most important overlooked things here is how you document and manage access to that data, protecting it no matter where it is, and then sharing that plan with your leadership, whether you're part of your leadership team or you're responsible for making them aware of the different stuff you're doing. I remind folks of this all the time as we speak to them. Remember, it's your fault regardless. So whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, if you're in charge of securing that information, when there's a breach, not if, when there's a breach, it is going to be someone's fault. But if you've documented how it happened, why it happened, and you make them aware at a leadership level of, there's different security concerns and there's no such thing as 100% secure, despite what they might want to hear you say, communication and sharing that plan with your leadership is huge. So when we look at data governance, security, multi-cloud strategy, a couple things to touch on as far as, we'll call it the state of the state. As an IT professional, nowadays application hardware knowledge is simply not enough. I have one of my associates on the line with us as well, Matt Burkowski, who does a lot of work in tribal space, and we started our business years ago talking about business applications. And now today, when we meet with IT leadership and business leadership in tribal enterprise, tribal government, they're not necessarily asking us if a particular software application has a feature and function. They're asking us about how it runs, where it runs, how it's secured, how do we manage access to it, and how do we integrate to other things. So the knowledge is less about that application and hardware. It's more about the relationship to the full scope of how our end users and our community interact with the data that we're working with on that basis. So business and security are now the foundation of that conversation. And it's interesting that the CIO role or the CTO role has changed. When we look at finance and accounting, for example, as a profession, we used to see a chief operations officer as having something to do with technology, but nowadays there's more of a CFO influence and a CFO relationship between IT, and the operations type role has somewhat changed or even been removed. In some organizations, we'll see something called the Chief Digital Officer, the CDO. And I'm sure most of you may have not ever met a CDO. I think just as it's becoming cool, it's actually being phased out as the Chief Digital Officer role. But more importantly, that digital transformation that organizations go through is all going to have some level of cloud and security in that conversation. So the role does not get to be siloed anymore. So when you look at those C-level positions, what they're accountable for and what they're responsible for have evolved. And when you throw security and the cloud and how we are doing more with less in the IT space, depending on your level of integration into your company that you work with, that role is going to evolve continuously. And how do you move with it? One of the key things that we see as well is that when you look at the end user, you look at the ability for someone to bring their own device and hook it up to your network at your place of operation. Social networking and how people are able to share information through different social outlets. And then a big one that we find a lot of trouble with today in some of the organizations that we have depth into is IoT, the Internet of Things. You think about all the IP addresses that exist out there in your footprint as an IT professional that you're responsible for locking down and securing. And you look at the data that's being moved around there. What kind of documentation do you have to fall back on when something goes wrong? Again, not if, when. So again, documentation is a really big thing. Put some links here for you as well to go out there and look at some of the way that the role is changing at the C level for accountability, and then also look at some of the education on how you can take 2-day, 3-day short classes just to learn a little bit more about how to prepare for that kind of change that you're faced with and responsible for. So focusing on the data, governance is something that we can use as a term, but really, what does it mean? It's got to apply to all levels of the environment, policy and device-based. Make it the machine's fault. And I don't know if everybody gets that, but when you think about the types of policy you put in place, there are plenty of device or application or machine-based technologies to trap the content on your network, monitor what kind of data is going out, monitor what kind of data is coming in, the ports that it travels on, the different ways that you segregate that information. What is your policy? And how do you start defining what kind of data fits what policy? If you haven't made that exercise or that investment of time, or if you did it years ago, chances are it doesn't apply anymore. So how do we make that adjustment and put some time into that? Security's got to be planned and executed at all levels. For example, single sign-on is something that we get asked for nowadays with applications, but mobile device security and multi-factor authentication and single sign-on, depending on the environment that you run, should all be related to each other as far as the security footprint that an end user has and the resources that you're responsible for securing. Multi-cloud is somewhat of a new term when we look at strategy. Do you want to have all your eggs in one basket? There's so many different brands of cloud out there. You can see below, Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, Google. What if I told you that on one single device, all 4 of those cloud technologies or all 4 of those application front ends exist on one phone? So one mobile device has all 4 of those security concerns on it. Do you let that device hook up to your wireless network? How does it integrate into the casino floor if it's going to come on site through one of your vendors and they're going to hook into your network to do work? Lots of different things to consider there. So types of cloud that we speak on quite frequently, public, private, which could be internal cloud for yourself, third party, the government cloud, which is somewhat of a new flavor of different types of cloud with some perceived and additional layers of security. And then hybrid, which is the likely situation where you have some internal private cloud stuff that you're working on. Maybe you're leveraging a third-party environment, as well as maybe some public cloud tools that you use. And I put this on here for some comedic relief. A few months back, I actually had to explain to my father, who's sitting there with his iPad and his iPhone in his hand, not understanding why they're the same and how he gets phone calls on one versus the other. He's trying to configure iCloud, and I said to him, Dad, the cloud is on the ground. And there was that long, awkward pause where you really don't know what's going to come out next. And he's like, well, why do they call it the cloud, right? And it was it's about a half hour of my life I just can't get back. So I thought you guys would find that funny. When we talk about how we define data, and this has to do with our governance policy, I have a simple diagram off to the right where I have an end user that might have a desktop computer, I might have a laptop, I might have a cell phone. They're sitting inside our office space. Their cell phone's connected to the cloud and somehow connected to my world through their cell tower. Yet I have them connected through a switch to a router to my virtual machine host and several virtual machines to do their job. There might be wireless offered inside my office space. I have one, if not several different types of firewall technologies in place, both physical and software based, and we're all hooked up to the cloud. That's a very simplified drawing. I know that a few guys on my team could definitely take 18 more pages and add 1,000 more diagrams into that same picture, but that's a simplified look. The thing about data is that we have to secure it in every single one of those steps. So whether it's at the virtual machine layer, it's in transit on inside my own network, outside the firewall, up in the cloud, on a mobile device, and the end user device. A lot of things are implied in that simple picture. So how do we classify data? Relevance, risk level, and life cycle, and then the value of the organization is going to dictate how we secure that. If you think about those four classifications of data and how it applies to the simplified environment that I've drawn there, that's a lot of documentation and a lot of policy that you may not have today. So advice tip number one is be able to define the data that you have, whether it's at the application layer or it's at a storage layer, and then look at those physical components of how you're securing it. I bring up this diagram. I've had this same picture, if you can't tell by the primary colors used in it, for probably about 7 or 8 years. It hasn't changed, and it's still very timely. And the reason I put it up here is that many times when we're, as an IT professional, or even as a contractor working with IT professionals, having a conversation with leadership about where security and responsibility stops and starts as we look at different infrastructure strategies that may leverage some type of cloud. So on the far left, that's probably where most of us cut our teeth. On the far right, that's where the kids coming out of college, this is the only thing they know. And if they look at the far left, they can't even fathom that that's how we worked, right? The reality is we're probably somewhere in the middle where maybe we have more than one data center where we're putting our information. If everything's on premise, which is typically what we walk into for a tribal enterprise or a tribal government, how are they looking to use some software as a service to offload some of that? How are they looking to have not a single point of failure, but co-locate their data, still in the confines of managing their information with sovereignty as a concern, right? So if you're ever looking for a good diagram, as Chuck mentioned, this will be up. I think this is a great picture for your leadership. Sometimes it might be at a council level. It might be at a board level, depending on the situation inside your tribal organization. This is a good picture to show them so they understand the different types of cloud and the different levels of control you have as you move up into that space. So how do you classify your data? I like these four classifications. I'm not going to go through every single one of these in detail. Public, internal, confidential, and then regulatory. Noting that public and internal data could also be regulatory. So there's different ways to look at this information. You know, when we think about the tribal enterprise and we think about, the casino space that we're in, the credit card traffic and the financial information that we have around our players, the people we do business with, and just that whole retail front end of our enterprise, very complicated and very risky play on how we secure that. So defining data that way and being able to highlight in your policy and your process internally, one of these key issues is that as we look at things like, for example, I now want to put a mobile app on my player's phone, and I want to use that application to track or use geofencing to see if they're in my market, if they're within a certain mile radius. I want to hit them with a message because they've signed up to allow me to see where they are. Outside of the payment card and credit card information that you're used to protecting if you're PCI compliant, and hopefully that's the case, there's legislation right now that also governs the geofencing data you use to market to them. In other words, you now know where they were geographically, and you use that as an advantage to market to them. But it is considered personal information that you knew where they were, but they gave you access in that app they put on their phone for you to know that. You still have to protect the data, that says you know where they were at a particular date and time. Little things like that that creep into this legislation as it evolves over the years. If you don't have a baseline for what your policy and how you classify your data in writing, so that you can say, this is why we stored the data in this particular spot with this type of security on it, then it makes it hard for you to manage how and when you change something so that you can demonstrate compliance. So if you've never really gone through a data governance exercise, it's never too late to start by just simply defining the kind of data, the application, where it's stored, and who has access. And then once you've identified those data elements, flag them as public, internal, confidential, and regulatory. Easier to do when we talk about a document, because a document is an object that we can put definition around. But when you talk about the data in a data source, and you look at something as complex as a player development system, or you look at something, look at all the services you might provide to your member community inside the tribal government and all the information you have on them. They have to submit to you financial information to determine eligibility for services. You have their social security number. You have their birth certificate. You might even have their driver's license number inside one of your databases. But you have information that you might want to share internally between the different programs you have, but still maintain the individual's confidentiality inside the tribe. You have to be able to differentiate there and make that definition. If you've not gone through the exercise, start out with the world's easiest, most best documentation tool on the planet, Microsoft Excel, and start throwing the rows and columns in there. At a minimum, go through the exercise. So now you look at the storage once you've classified the data. In the security space, there's a CIA triangle, a CIA model that everybody relates to as when you look at the threat or the attack surface of the different types of compromise we see in security. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability are really the three guiding principles of what we're looking at when it's our charge to protect data. We're going to do that based on the classification, as you saw on the slide before, but then we have to look at the four principal ways of securing that information. And this extends into the cloud and the mobile devices. Keep in mind, if you're not considering your mobile devices as a cloud technology, and you haven't explained to your leadership that they're already in the cloud because you let people see your email and move stuff between their mobile devices, you've made a grave mistake. Mobile devices are part of your cloud strategy. Don't ever forget that. And if leadership doesn't understand that because they're fighting you on the cloud at a tribal level, you need to understand that, hey, listen, we're already in the cloud. It's just a matter of how deep in or out we are, right? That's really the conversation. So you look at the physical layer, you look at the application layer, how people are authenticated into those two environments, and then the level of encryption that you're placing on those data storage devices. Many times we'll find that, depending on your network knowledge and your role in the company, noting that we have IT professionals and maybe some business professionals on the call today, we'll look at the layer 3 inside, if you reference the OSI model of security into your environment. Layer 3, your switch fabric, your routers, your firewalls, everything at that front layer or the perimeter. Most folks have gotten into a good spot with that technology. Are they reviewing their logs on a daily basis to see what kind of attempts have been made to hack their data and their information? Maybe not as much as they should be, but they at least have some perimeter-based technology in place, and hopefully it's several layers deep. Things like DMZ to protect different types of web accessible resources. Hopefully they're using, network address translation or NAT on their front end so that their IP addresses internally aren't facing someone externally. Little things like that we expect are going to be in place. But the number one thing that people typically aren't doing inside their own environment is encrypting their data in their storage devices. They're not encrypting their own data because they assume their perimeter is so secure that they don't need to encrypt the information behind their firewall. Big mistake. If somebody gets through that firewall, now they have access to everything. Just look at all the breaches that we've had in the past few years. They had great perimeter security, but it eventually got cracked and nobody had their data, including your personal and confidential information, your credit card information if you shopped at Target as an example. They didn't have that encrypted in the back end because they figured it wasn't necessary. Not so much. So we look at this strategy and we say it's got to be against our cloud resources, our mobile, and our traditional on-premise. We should use a similar encryption methodology and policy to stretch across that new business fabric. So mobile device management is one of these key, huge risk areas that we see quite frequently. Put out an article there for you guys to click on, take a look at. There are many different types of mobile device security. This one has a comparison of all the ones that are out there. It's very recent. It's actually in January of 2018. I suggest if you're responsible for managing the mobile device security and how it hooks to your environment, you should look at this resource and make sure you at least have some technology in place to prove to your leadership that you've made that investment. So when we look at documenting, managing, and monitoring access to the data, there's typically a couple things that we're looking at: who, where, why, and when. So who? That's that authentication piece. Multi-factor authentication, or MFA, as another acronym to throw into the IT mix, not that we don't have enough already. Device authorization. Does this device have a known commodity object inside my access control list in my front end? And then if I have content going in and out of my environment, am I using rights management? We'll touch on rights management a little bit further into our session today. But rights management is available in all of the different flavors of cloud: Amazon, IBM, Google, Microsoft. How do I use document level security to manage who gets to see what? And then where? Define the locations where data is stored very carefully. If you have data being stored on a mobile device, if it's not in session, that's a big risk. How are you securing that device if it's not your device, right? Your type of connection to the internet. If you have a small office or home referred to as a SOHO router that's in one of your satellite offices, for example, many times we'll be in a tribal community and we have the main tribal campus that we're doing work on, and then we'll go out to a satellite health clinic or a satellite jobs program or a satellite services arm, and they're using a small SOHO router, and it's just simply not secured with the same level of access and management capability because it was done low budget at the network level in the main campus. Well, it's a wide open hole because it does have authentication into that main security platform that's not being secured right. So where do we have these threats? Do I have people using a laptop in an airplane, on a coffee shop, and someone gets to that laptop? Can they get to the data on the machine? So what does that point to? That points to device level security. If it's important enough to secure and someone's asking to have access to it, make sure you have a reason code. Sounds like it's something pretty simple, but believe it or not, sometimes we find out that people have access to stuff. It's like, well, who gave them access? And then the next question is, well, why? What's your reason code at an IT level of why that person was given access to that resource? And then when? It's not like any of us have free time to sit there looking at logs. But if you don't have time on your calendar today as an IT professional, if there's not a block, it's somewhere at least once a week where you're spending a few hours randomly looking at logs, at a minimum. When something happens and you find out that it was in the log and that someone had, 63,000 active sessions open at one time on your network and you weren't aware of it, you tracked it. Now it's a matter of record. And like we started out the presentation, security, data, and data governance is your responsibility, you need to be looking at that stuff. And you need to store the reporting of those logs the same way you store the documents and everything else that you have retention on. So be able to go back to that stuff 30, 60, 90 days and make sure it's a secure location so that you have a record of those logs. It could be your job. It could be a legal requirement that you have to provide. Make sure you're doing it correctly. So protect the data no matter where it is. That's number one of 3 different slides on protect the data. Physical resources, data at rest. When you think about securing your storage devices, one of the biggest intrusion weapons that we see today is a USB device. How many of you guys have been out to a trade show and someone hands you a complimentary USB device? It's got a whole bunch of information about them on it. I got to tell you, that's probably one of the biggest reasons and one of the biggest risks. Where are all those USB devices made? They're made in China, right? That's where most of them are made. How do you know something's not on that device that's coming over and now you're plugging it into your computer and you just created another node and a botnet attack in a denial of service that you can't get away from, and it's just sucking all the data right off of that machine. And all you did was take a thumb drive that had a PowerPoint on it from a vendor at a trade show. So tell everybody, make sure if you're looking at that data footprint and it extends beyond cloud, mobile, and your on-premise environment, removable storage, USBs, just say no. Biggest risk. If you need them, secure them. In other words, make sure you issue those devices to the people that need to move that data around. Like in your own IT department, if you have somebody that needs to load software somewhere and they're walking around with a USB device, well, make sure it's not one that came in your IT guy's pocket. Make sure it's one that was issued by IT. It has encryption on it. It's been formatted and it's a known commodity on your network. All right. Network attached storage. That could be, any of these things could be a whole session in and of themselves. But one thing to see here is that a lot of times we'll look at someone's VM host environment where they have virtual machines. We might be loading software to it. And we'll notice that their network attached storage is actually part of the same LAN. Good best practice, segment the storage off the LAN and onto its own WAN so that it has a separate type of security placed into it. You have a physical capability, a virtual capability to secure that. And then, of course, you're going to encrypt the data on those devices. Whole disk encryption is something that we've all had at our fingertips, I guess officially or pragmatically since Windows 7. Not too many organizations take advantage of BitLocker because the odds of the end user being able to remember what that key was are pretty small. And they don't put big investments into tracking what that is. But if you really want to secure your device and you're using a Windows operating system, which I'm going to assume most people are, turn on BitLocker. All right, you get full disk encryption. You can select 128 or 256-bit encryption, and it uses cipher blockchaining out of the box. No excuse not to have that device secure if someone leaves their laptop in a rental car and then flies home. And that may or may not have happened to us at Arctic IT. Good news is BitLocker was on. We just kissed the device goodbye, and we're good to go. Hardware security modules, a little bit more costly to put in place, but that's something else that we'll see on strategic devices where we have a lot of travel and there's a lot of exposure. Talked about securing mobile devices, but a little bit more here. Authentication, device encryption. Sorry about that. Device encryption on a mobile device is one thing that most organizations don't make the investment in. Get into an MDM tool, figure out what your most cost-effective play is based upon your needs, and put that into effect right now. It's one of the biggest risks that you can have out there, because most of those mobile devices are accessing your cloud resources or your on-premise resources, and their connection baseline is different than the other devices you secure. Harden the operating system, remove unnecessary applications. If you don't have a baseline config deployed, you're already at a massive disadvantage for creating and monitoring the change that you need to absorb as this stuff rolls forward. Many times we walk into a group, they do not have a baseline config. They have one program or department in the tribal government that went out to Best Buy and bought 10 brand new Windows, PCs, or they have a bunch of iOS devices and they think because they're Apples, well, they're just secure because it's an Apple. We all know in the IT world that's simply not true. It's just not true. So make sure your baseline and anything that's plugged into your network adheres to that and document it. Okay. Good article out on Event Tracker, securing removable storage, information, tips, and tricks. If you're interested, I put that link out there so you can take a look. And then the third, or I should say the next one here is virtualization. Virtualization is here to stay. Now secure it that way. A lot of us got into virtual machine technology and we kind of grew organically with how it came about. We've implemented different flavors of virtual machine hosts and hypervisors, but we focus maybe, if we're lucky, patching and updating those operating systems on the VMs. But many times the actual hypervisor software itself is 3 or 4 versions behind. If you're not having a normal patch routine outside of the virtual machine operating systems, on the host software itself, you're leaving yourself wide open to data breach. You got to make sure that you're securing that stuff and put it into your normal patch update rotation. If you got Patch Tuesday, if you got patch 30, which is at the 30th day of every month except February, of course, make sure that your host operating systems for your VM hypervisors are getting updated. All right. And sometimes we'll see people that just are using standard bridge connections on the back of their VM chassis. That's bad news. Try to VLAN off that traffic, use network address translation. A lot of times if we're using fiber channel NICs, we'll go in the back there and they're just using a bridge connection by default because that's how it came out of the box. Some of the smaller tribal organizations we work with, they might not know enough about it before they just turned it on. Double check those things. Unnecessary hardware in a VM like a USB port, get rid of that. Don't use it. There's no need for it to be there if it's not going to be leveraged. Little things like BIOS configuration, boot from hard drive only is default. Make sure that's on a VM because it might not be the way you built your machine. And make sure group policy wraps up those VMs. Maybe even have group policies specific to those VMs so that you're monitoring how it gets done. Some additional tips that kind of line up to some of these strategies can also be found at this link here. With thestateofsecurity.com. Great website for that kind of stuff. All right, so cloud. Don't assume that because it's in the cloud, it's secure. It's really just an extension of your environment. If you move to the cloud and you're going to use a virtual machine, software as a service, there is some security that you should expect to be in place. But if you simply stand up a virtual machine, say in Amazon Web Cloud or in Microsoft's Azure, the device security itself for that server, when updates are applied, how they're applied, is no different than a virtual machine server you have physically at your fingertips on premise. Make sure you're looking at it that way. And if you're giving somebody the responsibility and the capability to do that in your environment, make sure you're referencing back to that base or baseline architecture and that machine fits that build before you actually hook it to your network. All right. If you're going to encrypt your devices on the ground, your mobile devices, why not encrypt your cloud storage? Very important to consider. Any of those cloud providers today, even third-party cloud providers today, will give you the ability to encrypt your data in their environment so that you can manage the key. And that's pretty important. If you have the key to manage that data, even if they're subpoenaed or there's a breach, you've ensured that your data in their cloud is secured by you, and they can't give up the key because they don't even have the key to the data you've secured in their environment. That's a pretty important relationship to have with your cloud provider. Put some bullets here for software as a service. Is it multi-tenant? Is the security infrastructure multi-tiered where the application layer is multi-tenant, but my data is unique to me and I have my own data resource? Those are things to ask. Do I have access to my data despite the fact that it's a SaaS option? Make sure you have the flexibility of choice if you're going to explore that stuff. Is there different authentication options? Is there different levels of authentication? Active Directory in most people's environments can be plugged into an Amazon or even a Google or a Microsoft environment today so that you have some type of single sign-on relationship. There are different flavors and depths of that. Make sure you evaluate those options when you're looking to secure the authentication side of data. Logging, subscription management, and cloud-only accounts are something that you should be doing in your software as a subscription. Microsoft, for example, if you have an Office 365 environment, will show you failed login attempts, successful login attempts, how long someone's session was, page views inside that session, manage the subscriptions that people have. Don't give someone a subscription to a software that they absolutely don't need. The same way you don't have an application on their computer just because it came with the base OS, you pull it off so you don't have a vulnerability there. Do the same thing in the cloud. And then if you give people cloud-only accounts, make sure you're creating an object in your Active Directory for that cloud-only account so that you know if somebody leaves the organization, not only did you delete their or take away their privileges for AD, but you also hit their cloud security as well. Some additional contents on Azure Rights Management, just as a suggestion for you to go to. I put a link there, some great information there that we leverage quite a bit. I put a slide up here for sovereignty. Sovereignty in and of itself is obviously a massive question that we deal with on a day in and day out basis. Sovereignty as a straight definition, and then tribal sovereignty as we know it in the tribal enterprise. When we look at data sovereignty in and of itself, and some of the arguments that our organizations make, as Chuck said earlier when we started the session, the argument that the cloud is less secure is probably not true in comparison to your own physical infrastructure. Although your leadership might like to hang its hat on that perception, that's probably not true. And is data more sovereign in a managed cloud service versus the server that you have it on premise to your environment? Is sovereignty transferable from one cloud to the next? All kinds of legislation swirling around right now that will affect the precedent that tribes rely on for their sovereignty in and of itself as it relates to the cloud. There is no true precedent right now other than individual data sovereignty versus business versus government versus tribal sovereignty as it relates to their information in the cloud. It's all on a level playing field right now. So that's kind of an odd spot on the board to be, but this is some good information for you guys to take a look at if you want to explore the term sovereignty and how it relates to business, data, and potentially a tribe as this rolls forward. Again, could do a whole nother hour on that, but I'll just leave that information at a link level with you. Okay. All right. One of the things I stressed early on here is that you want to share the plan with your leadership, educate your users, and remember, it's your fault regardless. And I know that seems kind of harsh, but everybody's going to look to you when there's a problem with your data. Regardless of cloud, mobile, or on-premise, you need to have leadership know that you look at that as one surface. You look at that as one surface and you're building a security practice in your IT space around that data, regardless of the device it's on or where it sits. Don't let them assume that you've just got this. Let them know what your challenges are. Remind them that there's no such thing as 100% secure, and if that's their expectation, they're out of line. Let them know it's a matter of when, not if. Business continuity is expected. Do they know your plan in case you have a breach? Have you ever said to them, hey, listen, if we have a breach, this is how I plan on handling it. Does anybody have an issue with this? Have you ever had that conversation with your leadership as an IT professional? If you haven't, you got to do it right away. Even if you're not prepared for it, you got to let them know that you're thinking about it and talking about it with them. That's a huge step in the right direction, depending on your level in your organization. How often do you educate your users? Do they take a quiz each year to understand how to protect data as an end user? Because that's where it starts. I like telling everybody this. Every organization has at least one user that'll click on anything. There are tools now. One of the ones that we use quite a bit in our managed service practices is called Sophos. Send out a fake or a real test on that theory. Obviously you're going to get some comedic relief out of it as an IT professional on who clicks on it. It's usually someone that you don't expect. You expect some folks in your organization to have, a little bit better of a judgment call on that. So use it as an educational opportunity. Every once in a while, depending on your budget, hire a third-party firm to assess your security, look at your baseline, look at some holes, and give you some recommendations. That's a really good investment to make. It's hard to come up with excuses when you have not set expectations. Just remember that last point. If you haven't met with the team who's holding you accountable for managing data security, as you look to leverage cloud and mobile and they think you're doing it all, make sure you set expectations, because you're not going to be able to defend when something goes wrong if you haven't had those conversations. Right, a little bit about Arctic IT for those of you that may not be familiar who we are. You go out to our website, www.arcticit.com. You'll learn about a little bit of our history, who we work for, where we're located. We have three main areas that we focus on: managed services, application services, and tribal enterprise services around managing everything from web-based applications to on-premise applications, software as a service, and anything in between. If you can't tell by the bottom of that slide, we're somewhat of a Microsoft-focused practice. We have stepped out of that box over the years, and without exception, every time we've come back to that, because it represents an overall holistic strategy and approach for the data governance and the applications that we work with. So a little bit about us. And then I think we have some time, about 15 minutes or so, for questions, Chuck. So.
Yes, thanks, Dave. That was great. A lot of good information in there. I would encourage the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in right now, and we will certainly ask Dave. Dave, one thing that I want to bring up on the topics that you covered, a topic that seems to come up over and over every year at TribalNet was one of sovereignty. And you touched on that a bit, but there are quite a few tribes that really don't want their data leaving their tribal property. And I've had numerous people come up to me and say, what do you do about this? And I've been fortunate where I was able to bring that up to our council many years ago and say, look, these are the things that we wanted to do, email archive as an example. And more things over the years have been pushed to the cloud here. Do you have any words of wisdom as far as how they can tackle that problem?
I do. I brought it up there. Of course, we constantly get the same type of question as well. We've presented at TribalNet and many other tribal events on that term. We get the repeated question, and the reality is that you go back a few years ago when we started talking about cloud, there probably wasn't too good of an answer other than, you have to measure the risk. Where do I feel the least chance of breach or the least chance of security might be? And then you have to look at the kind of data you're trying to protect and what those protection options are. Those things have evolved quite a bit in the past few years. For example, if you're in an Amazon web cloud or you're in a Microsoft cloud and you want to leverage server-based resources and storage, there's competitive products. Even IBM, I think, has one out there now for its cloud, where you can place your data into their environment and you can encrypt it with your own encryption key. Microsoft calls it Key Vault, if you want to look up some of that information and competitive products there. But that means that you've kind of lost hanging your hat on, oh, my data is not sovereign up there and it's protected, because now you're saying that, well, as long as it's encrypted, as it leaves my firewall and heads up to Microsoft's cloud, so it's encrypted in transit, which most of your transport protocols would permit and enforce. Once it sits there, if you put key vault in place on that storage volume inside that cloud, well, you're the only person that can decrypt it now because you have the key. And even if Microsoft themselves was subpoenaed or Amazon was subpoenaed by some state or government agency to have access to that data, that puts Microsoft, Amazon, IBM in a perfect position to say, yep, they do have their data here, but they use a key vault subscription or an encryption service where they own that key. So you're just going to have to ask them. And then your sovereignty is right back in your hands in that perceived question. So encrypting your data where it sits is now a better option than many times of even having it on premise if you're looking to leverage the cost effectiveness of a cloud service, where you couldn't do that in the past. Not as much of an option as it is today. The other thing is email. Email is something that leaves our firewall, gets out into the ether, and transfers all across our devices in our environment. If you're looking to have your data be sovereign so that you can control who has access to it for things like e-discovery and things like that, most tribes today, I think it's more along the lines of probably 170, 180 tribes, have let email, Office 365 or Google Docs or something to that effect go out there, because the sovereignty is not so much of a question anymore, because it's a communication protocol that they don't necessarily get to protect because they let it leave their firewall already. So those are two areas where we can address sovereignty and say that there is some implied sovereignty or lack of need thereof in situational type things, but nonetheless should be considered. A third point is sovereignty transferable? Right now, the country of Germany has a lawsuit against the United States because of a data breach on a retailer here in the US. And just this is the precedent side of it, so it's pretty interesting. German tourists on vacation in the United States, so in the proverbial wall of the United States, maybe not so proverbial depending on budget, but you're sitting here in the US and you're a German citizen, and someone hacks your personal and confidential information. They get your social security number or whatever the equivalent of that is in Germany, your credit card information, your passport information, because someone breached a hotel. Germany sued the US to say that their sovereignty rode along with their citizens into the US, and the US is liable for not protecting the sovereign data of Germany's citizen. So just let that marinate for a second. And then as soon as Germany filed that suit, Canada did the same thing to the US, and the US countersued. So I don't think tribes are going to have to argue the sovereignty precedent. I think other countries are doing it for them. It's kind of my spot on the board there. Very interesting dialogue. There's no judgment made on those cases yet. I think they're going to brew for years. But if you think about your tribal data and you want to take that data and move it into, let's say, another tribal data center, or Microsoft's cloud or Amazon cloud, does your sovereignty follow the data because it's related to your citizens? I don't know. That's something that's yet to be developed. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I think this is one of those problems that we're all seeing that time will tell, and things will continue to change and evolve. Well, with that, Dave, we'd like to say thanks. That was a great presentation. We certainly appreciate it. To everybody on the line, again, thank you for showing up today. I'd like to remind you that on March 13th, we'll have another presentation by Splunk, the impact of critical IT incidents on tribal organizations. So we look forward to seeing everybody then. If in the meantime you have a topic in mind, please email tribalwise.com. And if you have a question on training, again, we are here to help you in any way that we can. Please let us know. There are a variety of ways that you can contact us, including going to tribalwise.com. So again, thank you everybody for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you all again next month.
Take care. Thank you very much.